All right. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Hopefully you can all see me and hear me okay. My name is Brinley. I'm an organizer with Decarcerate Utah. I'm one of the co-founders. And today I'm going to talk about the inland port and the state prison relocation. And before I start, I just want to say that I am speaking here from a place of humility, recognizing that I'm giving this speech on stolen land, and I'm really grateful for the work that Uplift Climate does in abolishing borders, abolishing ICE, and honoring Indigenous sovereignty. So I'm just really grateful to be here and happy to give this presentation. So the state prison relocation is really a case of looking at prison reform, and as you'll see throughout this presentation, it's not worth it. I think we should take more abolitionist perspectives with transforming our state. So before we begin, I just want to start with a question for the audience, and you can grab a notebook, or if you have a document setting on your computer, you can write in a document real quick. And I just want to invite you to use your imagination and think about where you were 1,000 years ago. So hopefully nobody on this call is actually over 1,000 years old, but I want you to imagine what life would have been like, what the land might have been like, what your relationships might have been like. And while you're doing that, I would like to invite you to just take a few deep breaths and focus on grounding yourself. I'm a yoga instructor as well, so I think it's good to just take a moment to kind of breathe and feel the sensations in our body, feel the parts of our body that are connecting to either a chair or the ground. So thinking about 1,000 years ago. And the reason I want to invite you into this practice to start is for a trivia question. I'm wondering if there's anybody who knows what the longest prison sentence was. I don't know if people are able to go in the chat or put a question and answer in here, but if you want to guess in the chats, or if you're on Facebook Live in the comments, what the longest prison sentence in the United States that's ever been given. I'll give you a hint, it's not 1,000 years, but I won't go any further than that for a little bit. And I'm not seeing any comments, so I'm just gonna assume that people, oh, here we go. I'm seeing 600 years, 140,000 years. None of those answers are right. 3,600 or 36,000, sorry. Any other guesses? 300? This is a fun game. This is a good trivia practice. 500. Daya, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correct. You're pretty close. The correct answer is 30,000 years. Oh, this is annoying. Let's go back. So what this tells me, 30,000 years, that our criminal justice system has a very vivid imagination. So as prison abolitionists, to counter that, I think we need to really work on our imagination as well. If they're thinking 30,000 years in the future, we should be thinking 30,000 years in the future as well. And just to give a quick overview of these topics, especially for people who are tuning in from out of state, the inland port is a proposed development project that is happening in the northwest quadrant of Salt Lake City, which is west of our airport. And it's a proposal to add more warehouse and train stations to basically increase the amount of shipping that happens within Utah, as well as coal transportation. The prison relocation is located pretty much right in the middle of this inland port development. And from my perspective, the prison move is essentially what started the whole process behind the inland port development. And this is also really close, as I mentioned, to the airport, which is undergoing an expansion right now, which means with it comes an increase of police presence, including ICE enforcement, since this is an international airport. So all of these things are connected in that way. Development is happening over sensitive wetlands. Over 10 million migratory birds use this land, and it's over 300 species. This ecosystem is very fragile, and it's been determined by scientists to be of global importance for bird migratory patterns. So the last thing we should be doing is contributing more towards climate destruction, especially towards this critical habitat. And this map shows that it's the land use is about 25% of Salt Lake City's total jurisdiction. And right now with the inland port, all of that tax revenue that they will be getting from this land use is going to go to the state rather than to the city. I think prison abolition is a really good way to help us imagine things differently. Just to give a quick overview, for the sake of time, this webinar isn't going into all of the nitty-gritty aspects of prison abolition, but to give just a high-level overview of reform versus abolition. Reform sees the criminal justice system as broken and they want to fix it, whereas abolitionists see the system working as it's intended to, and we're working on reducing its power until it becomes obsolete. And it's more than just the physical location of prisons or jails, and it's more than just police, because the prison industrial complex feeds into the military industrial complex, it feeds into media industrial complexes, and even academia industrial complexes. So all of these things are basically thanks to white supremacy and colonization and capitalism. So prison abolition is also seeking to abolish those things as well. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore is an incredible abolitionist and scholar who talks about abolition as being a presence. So rather than thinking of it as what we're getting rid of, we're building a world where people take care of each other, where people's material needs are met. And it's that presence of support that is what prison abolition is really about. The problem with prisons, they don't keep us safe. So a rise of prison populations doesn't indicate community safety. Over the years, crime rates have actually decreased, but the rise of the prison populations has happened because of the increase of the length of stay for each person it incarcerates. So this is driven by legislative decisions and not by community needs. Prisons are also not a place of transformation. Some people believe that you go to prison to get better, and then once you're released, you're just a better person overall. But in Utah, that's definitely not the case. There are more inmates that are there because they are incarcerated for a violation of their parole, rather than those people who are convicted with a new crime. And at the time I wrote this, that ratio was 70 to 30%, but that number is higher now. It's about 75 to 25%, according to the ACLU of Utah. They're also not cost efficient. So it costs about $22,000 a year for each person it incarcerates. That money would go much, much further if it was going towards someone's healthcare or schooling or housing, things that people aren't receiving enough support with. And I will also note that that $22,000 figure is only calculated from the yearly costs of maintaining the building of a prison in comparison to the amount of people we have incarcerated. So that doesn't include the costs of what the family has to pay. It doesn't include the costs of attorney fees or all of the other things that are kind of involved with locking a person away from their community. So that number is actually much, much higher. So when I was doing research into this, I wanted to know why officials thought that a move was necessary. I wanted to know when this became a topic of interest and who was involved in those decisions, what their motives were. And I also really want to know just how much longer we're going to continue to rely on prisons to solve our social problems. I think that we are failing to use our imagination the more that we just continue to reinforce this system. So again, at the time that I wrote this, the budget was $800 million. It's gone up now this year, up to $968 million. So it's almost essentially to $1 billion. It's probably going to surpass that this year or next, versus the price tag of remodeling the current site in Draper was estimated to be around $230 million. So why this huge gap? Why didn't they just restructure the current prison, which was built in the 70s and could probably use some updates, versus totally relocating everything and getting rid of that prison in Draper right now? So here's what they said. They said a new prison is going to reduce recidivism, but any investment into the prison system implies an expected return on investment. All of our legislatures are business people. They're all capitalists and developers, so they're wanting something out of this. They also said that inmates are going to have access to better programs, but people shouldn't have to enter the criminal justice system in order to receive the help that they need. They also said that it'll make offenders more productive members of society, but accessing services such as finding a job or finding affordable housing is still a huge barrier for many upon release, and Utah keeps cutting funding to these services in favor of policing the issue. And a new building isn't going to change that. So here's what else they said, and this to me is the most revealing part of any of the other things. Al Mansell said that I would say the economic benefit of the prison relocation is not in the millions, but it's in the billions, and not just in the single-digit billions. So Al Mansell is, he was the head of Point West Ventures, which is a venture capitalist firm, and they were lobbying the government for this move because they saw some value in the land in Draper because there's a lot of tech development happening there, and they wanted to unlock that land for their own benefit. I'll get into more of that a little bit later too, going through a timeline of all of the events. So just to give an overview of Utah's growing inmate population, we have around 7,000 inmates each day, and that's only in the state prisons. We have the second highest incarceration growth rate in the nation. We're second behind Idaho, which isn't a good stat to have for our state. And if you include people who are incarcerated in jails or federal prisons, in youth facilities, or otherwise involuntarily locked up, that number jumps up to 14,000 people every day. And if you include everyone who's on probation or parole, that number jumps up to 30,000 people. And if you've ever had a loved one incarcerated, you know that it doesn't just affect the one person that's locked away, it affects friends and family as well. So this is an issue that is rippling onto hundreds of thousands of Utahns every single day. So going into a brief timeline now of the relocation and noteworthy events. This has been a topic of interest in Utah for over a decade. So this is going to be the meatiest part of this talk. I'm going to give some names and dates for you to get into. So in 2010, that's when Point West Ventures, who I mentioned, started lobbying the state government. They specifically went to Wayne Niederhauser, who was the president of the Senate at the time. And he, 2 years later, created the Prison Relocation and Development Authority. And from now on, I'm just going to refer to that as Prada, since that's a mouthful. And Wayne was able to hand select 2 appointees to lead that. He chooses Representatives Brad Wilson and Jerry Stevenson, who we'll hear about a little bit later. The following year after Prada's form, the legislator and community members began to discuss the pros and cons of relocating versus restructuring the current site. This is where that report came with the $230 million price tag for restructuring the current site in Draper. And I will also note that the current site has 4,000 beds, but the most people it's had at one point is 4,300. So they are constantly over capacity. The new prison is supposed to have 3,600 beds is what they're reporting right now. But I'm also going to make a note about that later. And also in 2013, articles appear showing that Niederhauser actually also owns land near the prison and could have a conflict of interest, since the land will increase in value after the prison move. Governor Herbert is able to hand select 6 appointees to sit on this Prada board, making it 11 people total. And of those 11 people, only like 2 of them were representatives, politicians. The rest were all developers, or they came from the Utah Department of Corrections. Talks in Prada this year also talked about expanding the Gunnison facility. So the Gunnison facility is a prison located in central Utah. It's a little bit smaller and houses approximately 2,000 beds, I think. And they also talked about contracting more state inmates out to county jails like Daggett County. For people who are unfamiliar with what happened in Daggett County, I highly recommend looking into it more. For the sake of this webinar, I won't get into too many details, but it essentially just exposed how much abuse was happening in these jails and how little oversight there is. And there's also an economic incentive for county jails to use this contracting system, because they make about $10,000 a year for each extra person it incarcerates in the county jail. So in 2014, that's when Prada finally voted to make the move, and it was pretty much a unanimous decision. 10 out of 11 people voted in favor of it. The following year, when they're choosing different sites, Salt Lake City is pretty obviously the clear contender, and the mayor at the time, Rocky Anderson, opposed the move because of environmental impacts, which weren't and still are not under assessment. And that same year, the Gunnison prison expansion was approved, which allocated $30 million for approximately 200 more beds and 76 more employees. This is also the same year that the Justice Reinvestment Initiative passed, and the JRI was a nationwide bill where each state kind of had its own version. It was essentially passed as a criminal justice reform measure, intending to reduce the prison population, especially for nonviolent crimes. But as we'll see 5 years later, which I'll get into, that didn't really play out, or it hasn't played out. And in August, finally, the Northwest Quadrant in Salt Lake was chosen as the new state prison relocation. And later that year, we have a new mayor, Jackie Biskupski, coming in. So there was kind of a shift in attitude from 2015 to 2016, where 2015 we were opposed to it. In 2016, Jackie basically like went all in and wanted to, you know, take advantage of this relocation so that Salt Lake could build other things around it, since they were going to have to build roads and utility lines. So they wanted to make some sort of a profitable venture out of this. They were in the early talks of creating some sort of eco hub, which who knows what that would have looked like. In 2016, that same year, the press reveals that Brad Wilson has a conflict of interest because he developed a really cheap townhome thing, a group of homes, destination homes, and they were located less than a mile from the site in Draper. And the reason that it all came to light in the press is because somebody had a really bad flood in it and they weren't offering them any money or like help with the insurance claims. And also in 2016, the Board of Pardons and Parole audit happens, and it was pretty damning. The results from it showed that their process is really inconsistent and it's really vague and confusing. And these people make over 18,000 decisions a year, and it's all about length of stay. So this is where the heart of the prison population lives, is in the Board of Pardons and Parole. And they also weren't even keeping track of anything digitally. Everything was like handwritten, so they couldn't even read the handwriting of some of the board's decisions. And then questions about capacity come up. So here's where I said I would talk about this again. Officials in Prada actually wrote in the legislation that they can add up to 6,000 more beds, or sorry, 6,000 total beds within the prison's planned secure perimeter. And I am not able to confirm this, but I have also heard that there were talks about putting some private prisons or ICE detention centers in this area. So they're already in discussions about adding more before it's even like done in the first place. And these three images to the side, the top one just shows where the prison relocation is in relationship to the airport. The middle image is an overview of it, and then the bottom image is a view of the land as it is right now without any development. So the following year, 2017, the Gunnison prison expansion is complete. They try out a new direct supervision model, and that's where an officer is sitting in the center of the room with mirrors all around them, so they can get a 360-degree view of everyone rather than being located like in the back of a room and only seeing out in front of them. So just more surveillance. And ground is broken the same year for the new state prison. During the ceremony, the speakers had to pause several times because of the noise from the airplanes overhead. So with the airport expansion underway, this indicates that noise pollution is going to be a huge issue. And the same year, we saw Operation Rio Grande begin, which allocated almost $70 million to police efforts to supposedly curb houselessness in Salt Lake, which didn't happen. We still have a large community of unsheltered neighbors here who are not getting the support that they need, especially with this transition to the new resource centers. It's just not working. Yet we continue to fund police over these services. So in 2018, this is when the Inland Port Board Authority was created in the midnight hour of the legislative session. And as I mentioned, that delegates tax revenue to the Port Board Authority. So Salt Lake tried to sue the state for breaching their jurisdiction, but the lawsuit ruled in favor of the state, proclaiming that the board is a public corporation and not a special commission. So they're already using the language of business and profit in this move. And that same year in Prada, the legislators discussed using inmate labor to cut down on the prison costs, which is like the lowest of the low in my mind. Prison labor is already super exploitive by nature and shouldn't be allowed at all. But using that labor to cut back on the costs of your own prison is just, I can't even fathom that line of thinking. And in 2019, last year now, so we're getting close to today, The prison development is behind schedule and over budget. The initial estimates were around $550 million. Now they are up to, as I said, $1 billion and counting. And the projected completion date is now for 2022. Originally, it was supposed to be completed this year. With COVID happening, it might be pushed back even more. We'll just have to, we'll see what happens. And this same year, the results from the Justice Reinitiative show that it helps white people far more than the minority populations in Utah. So they made about 20% of the general population and almost 40% of those facing new felony charges. So a clear example of reform gone very wrong. And now some environmental hazards of the inland port. And this report is issued by the Stop the Polluting Port campaign, which is a group of volunteers and activists. The state still has not done any health impact statements. So the risks are air pollution is the biggest one, with an increase of the airplane traffic and trucks and trains and all of this. Is just going to contribute to our already bad air quality in Salt Lake. And it's the #1 cause of cancer, according to the World Health Organization. Other health risks include asthma, miscarriages, a number of autoimmune disorders, high cholesterol, and brain disorders. There's also going to be an increase in pesticide use due to the increase in human activity. Right now, the birds are able to eat the mosquitoes and the gnats that are in that wetland area, but with humans, they're going to need to use pesticides, and the side effects of that include obesity, cancer, heart disease, birth defects, neurological disorders, and impaired intellect. And then water pollution is another big risk. So paved roads mean an increase in runoff, including oil and grease, as well as other pollutants. And the sensitive wetland area is at risk of groundwater contamination, flooding, and serious damage during earthquakes. We just had an earthquake here in Utah not too long ago, and the epicenter was essentially right in this area. And many geologists are saying that this isn't even, the big one that is likely to come in a few years. So this is like really high risk for people who are going to be working there, not only in like working in the prison, but if they're working in the port, in the warehouses, or in the airport. This affects everyone that will be in that area, but the people who are going to be locked up will be affected the most because they don't have a way to leave. In 2020, so despite many budgets now are being cut because of changing circumstances from COVID-19, but the prison construction costs are still receiving almost $170 million this year. And they have even written into their debt bond repayments up to $1 billion. So they're already planning on the rise to continue. Right now, inmates in Draper are sewing 10,000 masks a week. And this is being sent to various state agencies and hospitals, despite many of them not having access to masks for themselves. This is a really big concern to us right now because as of May 29th, the Utah Department of Corrections confirmed that there was an inmate that was transferred from a county jail who tested positive for COVID-19, but there have not been any updates since then. If you've been following Decarcerate Utah for a while, you might remember that in April we had a Free Them All campaign targeting the Salt Lake County jails, which had confirmed cases, and they just do not communicate what is actually happening. So their silence right now is very concerning, especially because, incarceration measurably harms your mental and physical health. It negatively impacts your family and community health. Incarceration by ICE causes severe trauma to children, adolescents, and adults alike. And our criminal justice system disproportionately harms people who are structurally marginalized. So people of color, people who are undocumented, people who experience houselessness, people with disabilities, mental illnesses, people who use drugs, sex workers, and people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. So this is a very big concern for us to really keep us grounded in abolitionist perspectives, because we want to get everyone out as soon as we can. And then other things to look out for as Utah's population and economy changes over the years. So we may not be able to stop this prison construction from happening, but we can at least stop it from getting worse. And that includes being ready to oppose any talk about jail or prison expansion. So this could include the reopening of private prisons, which were outlawed in Utah in 2010, but we still have MTC located in Bountiful. MTC is the Management and Training Corporation. It's owned by a family called the Marquards, who are philanthropists in Utah who donate to many nonprofits and many politicians. A lot of progressive politicians accept money from them, so we really need to keep our eye out on that, because they are likely lobbying to start opening up private prisons. But even if they don't open them up in Utah, that doesn't mean that people will not be contracted out to other states, like we saw them trying to build a facility in Evanston, which would be specifically for the Salt Lake City ICE Department to use. We also want to be careful about language around state-of-the-art technology. This is usually code for more surveillance, and it's always used as an excuse to increase the budget for prisons and policing. We especially need to be conscious of this in Utah, because the development where that Draper site is called Silicon Slopes. They're trying to mimic all of the things that Silicon Valley are doing, which is not helpful, and it's not supporting our community's needs. We also need to be very careful when we use language around safety or reform. We need to put our investments into diversion and re-entry programs. We should be giving people access to help whenever they need it, and not because they've now entered into the criminal justice system. So, for example, drug courts are usually seen as a good criminal justice reform, but people should have access to rehab whether or not they get pulled over by the police. And we also want to be sure that we're careful about language around the redemptive nature of work. $1.75 an hour is the highest amount an inmate can make in Utah. So businesses right now have a huge incentive to use this labor, and state agencies especially take advantage of this. The University of Utah even gets their furniture built by inmates from Draper. People shouldn't have an incentive to participate in prison expansion, but with this cheap labor right now, they do. So looking now and beyond, resisting reform and building an abolitionist movement, or building that presence. So for me, that looks like shifting our ideas about self-care into community care. A lot of people talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs when they're talking about the self, and in that you need to meet your basic needs first. So you need to have food, water, shelter. These are all like really, really basic things that we are doing a terrible job at meeting people where they're at to provide this for them. So we can use that as one kind of template. Since I'm a yoga instructor, I like to think of the chakras, and I think that prison abolition is a really root chakra issue. And then you can think about how those chakras kind of go into other aspects of community care rather than just thinking about yourself. We also need to really address fears, intergenerational trauma, and systemic violence. White supremacy has just been allowed to go on for too long, and it's basically trying to fit everyone into this mold, into a tiny little shoebox. But we shouldn't treat differences as a punishment, which is what we do now. If you want to read more about this, I highly recommend reading Audre Lorde's essay, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, about how you can celebrate differences and work together interdependently rather than independently of each other. And we should also invest in a sustainable future. We should invest in programs that generate healthy relationships with both each other and with our environment. And I especially want to speak to the white listeners right now when I say that you should be really careful when you use language about humans being the problem in regards to climate change. That echoes a lot of eco-fascist thought. Humans aren't the problem. The problem is white supremacy. The problem is capitalism. It's colonialism. Those are the issues that we need to be addressing when we confront climate change, not just humans. And to close out, now I want to invite you to think about where you want to be 1,000 years from now. So thinking ahead into the future, 1,000 years, we'll probably never be alive, but we should still fight for making a better world, not just for, you know, in capitalism, all these plans are like 5-year plans or 10-year plans or 20-year plans. They're so short-term because they're so focused on generating a profit as fast as they can by exploiting land or by exploiting labor. But with prison abolition, we can think generations ahead and we can start building that future today. So I really want to invite you to, again, use that imagination to confront these things that we're seeing and think not just in your own lifetime, but in lifetimes and generations to come. And there was even an early quote that I found from someone named Lane Summerhays, who sat on the Prada board in 2013, said that this looked like a 70-year plan. So if you look at the history of Utah prisons, that has been about the lifespan of the Sugar House prison versus the current prison in Draper. So even, like I said, if there's no way we can stop this prison development from happening, which I would love to hear if anybody has ideas how to make that happen. But even if that doesn't happen, we could say right now that we're going to be the last generation to ever build another prison. And then in 70 years, this can all be over and we can have a different world that we're all connected in and feeling that kind of interrelatedness to each other. So I'll go ahead and just go to my last slide to show you how to find us, to stay in touch, and I'll open it up now to any questions that may have come up in the chat or on Facebook. Let's see.
Thank you so much, Brenly. Unfortunately, we were having technical issues and I wasn't able to connect to the Facebook. But this webinar was recorded and it will be uploaded for everybody to see afterwards. But yes, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to you and to Decarcerate Utah for the powerful, powerful work that y'all have been doing in our community for such a long time now. You know, y'all have been holding it down. And I wanted to also invite for participants to ask any questions and for us to start that Q&A process.
Oops. I'm seeing someone ask if the host mind if I screenshot and share some of the slides. I don't mind at all. Go ahead. Yeah, abolition should definitely be global in its scope. I'm looking at Matt's comment here. Argument about whether the prisons are cost efficient assumes the point of them is actually anything other than oppression. That's a really good point, that there is no other point to that. There is no other point to prisons. I'm not seeing any other questions. Are you, Ella?
Yes, there is a new question. How would you advise people get involved in police/prison abolition work?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yes, how would you advise people get involved in police/prison abolition work?
Yeah, I would start by reading Angela Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete? That was the thing that kind of like just solidified it for me. When I was like doing my early research, I was like, I don't know about this, sounds kind of crazy. But Angela Davis is just an incredible writer, and it's a really short book. It's really easy to read. And there are tons of free versions of it online. You can find it pretty easily from a Google search. So I would start there. And that'll lead you to a lot of other places as well.
Yes, Angela Davis is such a resource and such an incredible elder in our community. Another comment says, I'm listening to Angela Davis lately. She speaks a lot about intersectionality. I'm listening from Chicago, and so many of the things that you're describing relate to Lori Lightfoot's Cop Academy. Can you speak to the global issue of this?
So I'm not too familiar with Lori Lightfoot or what's happening in Chicago. I kind of know like surface level, but essentially just like I said, the prison industrial complex and the military industrial complex are really intertwined. So globally, we see this a lot, like especially in Israel. Their military is like trained by our own military, who then give equipment to our police departments across the country, and they're given this equipment for almost no cost at all, which is why you see police out there in riot gear and with weapons targeting their community, because they're getting it from our military, who are targeting people across the world. And this is usually because of greed, right, and exploitation, and wanting to take over someone's land for their natural resources.
The question boxes are popping, Brenly. We have another question that says, do you have suggestions or resources to hold our states accountable? I'm from Idaho, and I'm just learning that we are #1 for incarceration rates. I want to do more research.
I would start by looking at your state budget and looking at the legislators that are on any sort of criminal justice board or commission or whatnot, and just look at like the things that they're talking about in their meetings. Look into your local news, like you could just research Idaho State Prison. I don't know anything about the prisons in Idaho, so I can't point you specifically to places, but Google searches and looking at the news, and just like keep digging, don't give up. Don't think this is gonna be also like something you're gonna understand overnight. This presentation was like 3 years in the making and 3 years of research. So just remember to like keep that perspective that like you're not gonna find all the answers that you're looking for right away, but I really encourage you to keep like looking and like look at what's happening nationally. And oftentimes the things that we see happening in other cities and other states that are like making national news are happening right in your hometown as well. So look at those national stories and see if something like that is happening in your own community.
All right. There's a few questions that we have. One is, how do you think we can normalize the idea of abolition in the United States so we can see the change we need? And maybe we can pair this up with the question of, do you have a resource for the most reliable list of companies who use prison labor? So much is unclear. So yeah, resources and wanting more resources in general.
Yeah. So to the first question, how to like normalize abolition, I think it just comes with having more conversations, attending these webinars. We're doing this every Saturday for 3 more weeks. So be sure that you're tuning in to the other webinars that are happening in this series. As far as like what companies use inmate labor, there's a organization called Worth Rises, and they have reports of every single company pretty much in the US that uses prison labor, and they also break it down by state. So you can look if you're from Utah or if you're tuning in from Idaho or Chicago or wherever you are, you can go to that website and filter it by state and figure out which companies are using labor. And I'll also note that like oftentimes it's the government using inmate labor. So try to like keep that in mind too. Like you might not find all of the corporations that are using this labor because it's hidden under the government's budget.
And maybe we can type out that website onto the chat, Brinley, so that way folks can go ahead and look at it. Just because I'm getting some comments asking about what was that website about prison labor again, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the website is, but the company or the organization is called Worth Rises.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. We are also getting the question of, have any organizers or media called out Prada?
Not that I know of, other than us. Yeah, the media in Utah has been like, I think really hesitant about picking up abolitionist like talks. And I haven't seen very many other groups that are talking about this.
Okay. Another question that we're getting is, do we know if the work is still being carried out at the inland port? I worry that we are not going to be able to do resistance work during the pandemic.
I have that same question. I'm not sure what's happening out there right now. I don't really know how to answer that because I haven't heard anything. I've been monitoring the news and I tried to see if there were any updates about the prison since last February, which was the last time I gave this talk, and I haven't seen anything. Could be something that we talk about in Decarcerate Utah, like trying to plan a coordinated action around, but right now, just wanting to get this information out there for everyone to know.
Oh, this is a really good one. Can you possibly speak to Andre Gorse's notion of non-reformist reforms versus reformist reforms and how to distinguish these in our thinking and our messaging?
Yeah, I'm not certain who that person is specifically, but I think that Critical Resistance has that chart that you're referring to, where it basically says like what kind of reforms are actually increasing police presence and giving more money to prisons and more power to prisons, and what kind of tools are abolitionist steps into reducing that power. So if you go to Critical Resistance website, criticalresistance.org, they have a section, I think it's under Abolition of Jails, and you can find, or Abolition of Policing, and there's a chart that has like, it breaks down like different topics and it asks,
Let me share my screen so we can go ahead and look at it.
Oh yeah, yes, that would be even better.
Go ahead, we're here at Critical Resistance. We're gonna go.
I think it's under resources and abolish policing.
Yes.
And then scroll down.
There's some toolkits, it looks like.
There it is.
Which one should it?
Quick links, it's like the third bullet point. One down. Oh.
That's okay.
There it is.
There we go.
So you asked, does it reduce funding? Does it challenge the notion that policing increase safety? Does it reduce the tools or the technology that police have at their disposal? Or does it reduce the scale of policing? This is specifically talking about policing, but you can use that same framework and just swap policing for prisons or jails and ask the same questions. So these ones in green are more abolitionist steps towards reducing the power and providing more supportive measures for communities.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Share Brinley. Now, I think we only have a few more questions. We actually answered this one. Oh yeah, I think this might be our last question. It says, as a student, do you have any suggestions for how I can get involved in abolitionist work?
Yeah, you can get involved with us. If you're in Utah, dcarcerateutah.org. In our contact page, we have a form to fill out if you want to get involved in our work. We're a growing group, so we could always use more help. Uplift Climate is doing amazing work around this as well, so definitely visit their website, get involved with them. Like I said, stay tuned for the other webinars that are coming up. I'm really excited for all of the other panelists that are going to speak over the next few weeks. So highly, highly encourage you to set aside this time every Saturday for the next few weeks.
Also, especially if your school doesn't have a club yet, I would encourage folks to start a club. Yeah, absolutely. I know that student-led organizing is honestly some of the most powerful organizing out there. You know, as young people, yes, we encourage you to just go ahead, even if it looks like starting a book club, starting a reading group. You know, a lot of times people think that organizers have to look a certain way or act a certain way, but everybody's an organizer, you know.
Yeah. I didn't come from an organizing background before I got into this work, and you just kind of like, once you like find what like speaks to your heart and like where your passion is, like it just kind of happens. And if you are a student at the University of Utah, we actually have a few students in our group as well, so I can definitely connect you there. But if, like Ella said, if you're at a different university, like start your own group. It's really easy, and you'll be surprised at how like receptive people will become and how it'll grow over time.
And if you ever have any questions or doubts and you're just kind of floundering because you're just like, I don't know, I started the group, but what's the next steps? You can always just reach out for help. I know that here at Uplift, we're really focused on young people, you know, work led by young people for young people. So that's actually totally our ballpark. And yeah, we're here as a resource. Please, please, please don't be afraid to reach out and ask for support.
Yeah, I think that a lot of other organizers reflect that same attitude. So other groups that, you know, align with your values, like reach out to them and just have a conversation.
Yes. We have a few more questions, if that's okay, Brinley. I know I've been keeping for a second. Let's see. How do activists try to be more strategic and see actions when trying to influence businesses? As we both know, or as we know, some people, businesses are irrational and don't seem to care about what's moral. It seems making the moral argument isn't enough and markets shift because of economic reasons. It takes too long for the economics to shift. Incarceration will likely continue because it will make money. Same with animal agriculture and extraction. Ooh, so the money questions. Okay.
That's a really good question. I don't have an easy answer for that. I think that you have to just keep fighting for a better world no matter what, even if you're not seeing any results from it, just because we have to. Like, what else do we have to do? We can't just accept the status quo. And you might be surprised too, like in the past 3 weeks in Salt Lake, we've seen, you know, thousands of people who have unified their message around defunding the police, and that seemingly came out of like nowhere. Like, you might be surprised at how like things can just shift in an instant. So you have to be prepared for those moments, and you just have to like kind of, you can't take those like failures or like blocks as like something that'll stop you from doing that work.
Right, and it goes back to everybody's an organizer, right? You know, the undocumented mothers hustling for their family to have wellness is just as valid as an organizer on the streets, right? So even if you're still changing the ideologies of the folks around you, whether it, you know, whatever ideologies you're shifting towards, if you're going towards it in an abolitionist way, then that's abolitionist organizing. You're doing the work. You're spreading those crumbs, you know, across to the masses, and that's such a huge part of the work, I believe. Another question that they had is, how can we hold police officers accountable for their violence without punitive justice? And then I'm just going to go ahead and call it. I'm going to say this is our last question. What are some of the biggest challenges of abolitionist work?
Answering questions like that is a big challenge. You know, any kind of like ask for a police officer to be incarcerated is just reinforcing the system, and the people at the losing end are not the police officers, it's the people who are marginalized already. So anything that's just reinforcing the system is like, nah. Transformative justice is like a really good framework for thinking about how to hold people accountable in ways that don't rely on the prison industrial complex. So I'm in the middle of reading a book right now called Beyond Survival, which I highly recommend. It's a reflection from different organizers who have worked in the transformative justice movement. And that's a really good way to start thinking about like what you would do to hold someone accountable for the harm that they did without just locking them away. And just, again, it's like you're losing your imagination if you're just relying on this system.
Yes, exactly. And I just want to honor also too, Brinley, that, you know, coming from two organizations that Decarcerate Utah and Uplift Climate, right, we're here in the Four Corners region. And, you know, just as you named, in the past 3 weeks, we have seen such incredible transformative work here in Salt Lake City, Utah. Like, I never thought we would be that city. And I'm gonna just say that I want to be accountable to my own lack of imagination in that, because I think at one point I just got in such a state of hopelessness that I just was like, who could imagine, you know, when, where, and why? And now that it's happening, we're seeing this, and you know, for myself, it's an honor to just be a part of it, even in just a little part, right? And that's really what abolitionist work is. It's we're chipping away at it. We're working together collectively to make this our new normal.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much. I just wanted to again speak to the fact that we are going to be having these conversations every single Saturday for the next 1 to 3 more weeks, right?
So exciting.
Yes, we are so excited. Something funny is that we were actually planning this series before the uprising started happening. So for us, it's been, you know, a blessing and good timing to be presenting all of these conversations back to back to make sure that folks have access to these topics. You know, as Uplift here, just want to say again, thank you to Brinley, thank you to Decarcerate Utah, and yes, a blessing to be in community with y'all.
Yeah, thank you so much for this collaboration, and I'm really excited for what's to come.
Thank you all so much. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thank you for joining us. And yes, make sure to look up Decarcerate Utah for more resources and Uplift Climate for more resources. Thank you.
Bye, all.
Bye.